Hello, everyone. My name's Bastani. You're watching a one-off show, I guess. It's me discussing a reading list I recently published over my personal website, luxurycommunism.com. There are 20 books. After all, it's 2020. If you want to check out this reading list, go to luxurycommunism.com. It's on the blog, latest post there. And as we go through these books, I'll try and be really quick because there's 20 of them. They'll come up on screen. You can see them for yourself. We're all going to have a lot of time to read over the next few months, unless, of course, you have a small child, in which case, my sincere apologies. I feel desperately sorry for you. But for people who are earning decent money, maybe working from home, perhaps on reduced hours, perhaps you're students, or maybe you're working reduced hours, not in the house, but you have more time to read. This is many, many people, not to mention people that will be self-employed, and hopefully the state will begin to look after more of you guys. There's going to be a lot more time to read. What I've tried to do is also make these books really accessible. I've tried to ensure that there aren't, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, War and Peace over 2 volumes, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. This isn't some wish list you're never going to read. This is 20 books, which I think are a real joy to read. They're almost all page turners, and I think they're of critical use in understanding the world as it is and how it's going to be. First one, Historical Materialism, Immanuel Wallerstein. There you go. This is like 105 pages. If I could recommend one book to introduce you into sort of Marxist Marxist historical thinking, historical materialism, this is it. Okay, historical materialism. Maybe that already sounds intimidating. It shouldn't. A really great book. And if you're trying to also maybe poke the curiosity of a friend or a family member and try and make them perhaps curious about the idea of history. Is it just a sequence of events which happen happenstance, accidentally moving from one year to the next? Is it driven by what Thomas Carlyle called, great men, sort of great men theory of history? Or is there a deeper set of underlying mechanisms? Marx claims there was, and this book is a brilliant prospectus overview of his system of thinking. Obviously, it's significantly developed afterwards. Very much recommended. Second book is Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. This is not Marxist. It's a much longer book, although I have to say it's, again, a real page turner. This was a really influential book for me personally because it was the first time, we've got it on the screen here, it was the first time I read a history book and I realized how there were underlying forces which determine human affairs, demographics, political economy, nature, all kinds of things. Gary's telling me I've skipped one. That's not good. Let's see what we've got. Capitalist realism. Well, you know why I've skipped that is because I don't have a copy of it. I'll go to capitalist realism after this. Let's stick with Paul Kennedy. It's a really, really, really outstanding book. It's more than 400 pages, but it's incredibly relevant. He wrote this towards the end of the Cold War, and he's predicting the rise of China. He talks about the impossibility of a military hegemon maintaining that status in the absence of a sufficiently large expanding economy, and the American state over the next 20, 30 years is probably going to test that hypothesis to destruction, much as the Soviet Union did in the final 30 years of the Cold War. One more thing as well I'd just like to say is that Gary's telling me in the comments here, there's an article right now over at NavarroMedia.com. Maybe get that up. And that's got the reading list for everybody at Navarro Media, not just me. I've contributed to a few titles to that. Giorgio Vasari, Lives of the Artists, Andrew Neil, Full Disclosure. You've got some there from Eleanor Penny, Ash Sarkar, James Butler. That's a great reading list. There's reading lists galore right now. So go check that out, obviously, as soon as you've finished watching this. Back to this. The third book, Capitalist Realism. I don't have a copy of it here. I don't know why. I've already given them all away. And like the first recommendation with Immanuel Wallerstein, Capitalist Realism is a fantastic book to just give to people. I think it's about 80 pages, slightly shorter than Wallerstein. The register in which it's written is a much easier register. It's a populist register, and that's not surprising. Mark Fisher was a social theorist of popular culture. His references are almost always about popular culture. And again, I'd really recommend that. That's a book you can read in a day, Capitalist Realism, just like with Wallerstein, a day and a half. And it could transform the way you look at politics. And like I say, it could transform the way that somebody looks at politics. If you want to give them a gift in the coming months, that's a great place to start. Number 4, Don't be too intimidated by this. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1, the Penguin edition. Now, bear with me. I said I wasn't going to get into big, heavy tomes that you were never going to read. The Road to Hell is Paved with Good Intentions. All I'm asking you to do is very simple. Read the introduction by Ernest Mandel, who in his own right was a very, very, very important, influential Marxist economist. Read the introduction and then read the first 2 chapters of the Penguin edition with the Ernest Mandel introduction. The first 2 chapters of Capital outline what he called the metaphysics of capitalism, which is to say that within those first 2 chapters, he examines the underlying, almost spiritual nature of the commodity in capitalism. Why are all these things produced? Why is this phone produced, this T-shirt? Why did you get a haircut? Who made these headphones? All of these are subordinated to the commodity logic, the commodity form. And even if you're not a Marxist, even if you don't necessarily agree with some of his conclusions elsewhere about, say, historical materialism, because he's a historian as well as a political economist, I think it's a really brilliant introduction for anyone who wants to know more about his thinking. The first 2 chapters, read it again, read it again. And a great accompaniment to that is David Harvey, Companion to Capital. And he has some online lectures. You can go check those out. If you just put in David Harvey lectures online Capital, they'll come up. Read those alongside Capital. I think you'll get a great deal from it. But just start with that commitment to reading 2 chapters over the next couple of months. Not that hard. Next book, which actually I just saw a glimpse of when we went to the Novara reading list a second ago, recommended by Alan Penny. This is fantastic. History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. I think one of the best applications of Marxist historical thought in recent years. It is absolutely fantastic. It effectively looks at the world, capitalism over the last 600 years, through the prism of cheapness, cheap nature, cheap lives, cheap care, cheap money. And it's a really, really, really good prism by which to understand historical capitalism. It starts with Portuguese sugar plantations in Madeira in the Atlantic Ocean. It ends up with the climate systems breakdown we see in the 21st century. A really stunning, rigorous application of Marxist thought. Now, we're, 4 books in? If you're going to read nothing else, and these are the sort of big reads, I put this at the top of the blog, these are the big reads I'd recommend anybody who's perhaps unfamiliar with Marxist thinking. Read Wallerstein, Historical Capitalism, Mark Fisher, Capitalist Realism, Marx, the first 2 chapters of Capital, and this book. And I swear to you, you'll have a better grounding in Marxist political economy and historiography than 95% of people who claim to know what they're talking about. And this is really important, by the way. It's something I've sort of really thought about over the last couple of years. Many critics of Marxism draw their criticisms from, unsurprisingly, the Cold War after the midpoint of the 20th century. But actually, we don't get the full canon of Marx's work until the late 20th century. The first translation of the Grundrisse into English, which for me is a really important part of Marx's thinking, isn't translated until 1973. It's not translated into Italian until 1968. Similar with the 1844 manuscripts. These are what might be called the humanist Marx, particularly the manuscripts, less so the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse has a lot to say, for instance, on automation. Those texts weren't available in English or French or Italian when many of the sort of anti-Marxist polemicists were drawing their arguments up in the 60s, 70s, 80s. People like Hayek, like Friedman. And I really think if you come to terms with the books I've just talked about, you'll have a better grasp of Marx than any of those guys, although perhaps that's not that hard. The next book is really, really good, somewhat different, and it's certainly not Marxist. Democracy in Chains. My angles are terrible here. The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. Now, often with histories of neoliberalism, there's a great book by Quinn Slobodian, Globalists. He did a podcast with us. You can go check that out on the Novara Media website. He did a Novara FM with James Butler. Often with people who sort of conduct these histories of neoliberalism, there is, with great justification, a focus on Friedrich Hayek von Mises, the Austrian school, which is, after all, where these ideas came from. And the important context to understand those ideas of neoliberalism, which is a real thing, if you go onto the Adam Smith Institute Wikipedia page or the IEA, Institute for Economic Affairs, they now openly call themselves neoliberal think tanks. I mean, if they're doing that, perhaps we should too. One of the interesting things is that this set of ideas isn't just grounded in the Austrian school or the aftermath of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Hayek, for instance, von Mises, it's important to understand they were coming from a political context which wasn't democratic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not a democratic polity. And the very technocratic, often anti-democratic tendencies they exhibit should be understood within that context. But what's so good about this book is that Nancy MacLean, she gets hold of the archive of a writer called James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics. It's not a real Nobel Prize. And he was one of the sort of fundamental theorists of rational choice, public choice theory, a very key neoliberal ideologue. And she actually says one of the main sort of political motivations as to why his ideas were taken so seriously in the South, places like Virginia, South Carolina, after the late 1950s, was the end of segregation. And so this idea of school vouchers, which even today is a very big idea amongst the new right, actually that was generated in response to desegregation in schools in the US South. So that there's more to the neoliberal tradition than simply the anti or undemocratic part of, the sort of aftermath of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. People like Hayek saw the rise of National Socialism. After that, equated any kind of national planning to fascism. That's where Hayek thought Keynesianism, the post-45 settlement, ended up. Fascism, Nazism, totalitarianism, which is obviously mad. It's a ridiculous statement to make. But there's also a different trajectory to neoliberal institutions and ideas. And that's a great book investigating them. Another, this might surprise you, key text in understanding neoliberalism, Andrew Neil, full disclosure. If you want a snapshot of the neoliberal revolution in the 1980s in Britain, get this book. I mean, look, hardback, I think it's like 50. I had some people give me some hate on Tysky Sour last night saying, I hope that cost you 50p. Yeah, that's probably what it costs if you go to an Oxfam or you buy it online as a secondhand book. Let's see. What's it? Hardcover, 82 pence, paperback, 39 pence. There you go. You're not going to be out of pocket buying it, although it's £50 for a new edition, which is interesting. I'm surprised they still exist, new editions, but there you go. Probably published first time almost 20 years ago. Amazing snapshot into the Thatcherite revolution. Andrew Neil, you might know him as the front man for the BBC, their leading interviewer. His first ever job was with the Conservative Research Department. After that, he went to work for The Economist magazine. This was when the ideas of people like James Buchanan, Hayek, Friedman were becoming more popular. Keynesianism was confronting very real political challenges. And people like Neil viewed themselves as ideologues, viewed themselves as part of a new right, created the sort of basis for the political settlement we've known ever since over the last 30 years. He talks about his time as editor at the Sunday Times, working under Rupert Murdoch, the Wapping strike, technological change in the industry. And actually, he's quite explicit about being to the right of the Thatcher governments. He's also very critical of John Major. You can see, because I think he's at the Sunday Times from 83 to 93. You can see how he's beginning to edge towards Tony Blair, or at least how Rupert Murdoch is edging towards Tony Blair. So it's a really fascinating book in terms of getting to understand better the politics and the personalities of the Thatcherite revolution, but also how there was a symbiotic relationship between media and politics. And often actually the boundary between the two. I mean, it's always permeable, but it kind of dissolved. Really, 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 really good book. Alongside another book I'm going to highlight in a second, probably my recommended book if you want to understand the British media a little bit better. It's written in a narrative form. It's well written. You'll breeze through it. So, I mean, it's 400 or 500 pages, but you'll get through that in a few days. Next, Grace Blakely, Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization. We've talked about neoliberalism a lot. I think if you read this in combination with the Nancy MacLean, you'll have a really good understanding of the concept and its history. Where Grace is really interested is, of course, applying it to political economy as it exists today. Financialization of the everyday economy, the role of financialization with regards to public services, PFI, etc., and how we have a system based upon debt instruments, financialized, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, all kinds of nutty things. It is it can be complex, but less than 300 pages. I think this alongside a book by David Harvey called A Brief History of Neoliberalism, I think would be two outstanding introductions to less the history of neoliberalism in the case of Grace, but more the ideas and the practice and the application. This is fantastic. This is a really good book. Again, stick it up your punter. Apologies for the title. The Rise and Fall of the Sun. Probably written a bit too early. Written, I think, in 1990-91. The sun definitely didn't fall in 1990. It survived its appalling coverage of Hillsborough. Although today it's important to say that the sun may be a year away from falling below the psychologically important 1 million mark in terms of circulation. At its high point, the News of the World was getting 6.5 million people a week. That was the Sunday paper of the Murdoch empire. And the Sun was getting 4 million people really during the mid-80s. Amazing image on the back of this, actually, which is, God, I'm terrible at this, aren't I? Because I'm trying to avoid the light. Basically, it's a page 3 model. Sam Fox sitting on top of an armored vehicle as she broke the picket at Wapping. A very famous strike in 1986, I think, in regards to the printing industry. Amazing book. Chait Chronicles. I mean, maybe we can just get this back up if possible, Gary. Now, we would never encourage people to buy books on Amazon, but if you're trying to get the cheapest possible book, it's secondhand. So be it. $1.95, paperback, less than £1. A really, really good book, full of amazing vignettes, anecdotes. Chronicles effectively the newspaper from it being purchased by Rupert Murdoch, I think in 68, 69. It's important to remember, by the way, the Sun's predecessor was a newspaper called the Daily Herald. The Daily Herald was set up by the radical left. It had a controlling stake from the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, until I think 1945. It was one of the most read newspapers in the country. And so this idea that all newspapers just follow public opinion isn't quite true, because the Sun's predecessor newspaper was a working class newspaper with one foot in the trade union movement. The Sun is obviously the complete opposite of that. That wasn't responding to what the public wanted. It was because ownership changed. So Murdoch takes it over in 68, 69, brings in a new editor, a guy called Larry Lamb. It just goes all the way through that. Larry Lamb was writing speeches for Margaret Thatcher in 1978. Of course, Thatcher wins the 1979 general election. Who becomes a knight in the 1980 New Year's Honours list? One Larry Lamb. He goes, replaced by Kelvin Mackenzie. A really astonishing proximity between the Sun and 10 Downing Street, particularly around the Falklands War. And again, this alongside the Andrew Neil book, I think highlights how degraded Britain's media became under Rupert Murdoch. It's in a really parlous state today. That wasn't inevitable. Yes, trust in media in many places around the world is very low. There's terrible media elsewhere, Fox News in the US, but guess who owns that? There's the same people more or less as the Sun. Rupert Murdoch, masterminded its huge growth over the 1980s as a news channel, Fox News. Rupert Murdoch really changed British media for the worse. Really, really, really for the worse. And these two books make it clear. Andrew Neil, Full Disclosure, and Stick It Up Your Punter. Peter Chippendale and Chris Horry. The same two writers, by the way, wrote a book about the failed News on Sunday, which was a short-lived Sunday tabloid, which was set up by the radical left. It was an absolute disaster. That's worth reading too. Very good authors. But that, I think, is superb. Stick It Up Your Punter, and very cheap. The next one, in terms of how bad the media is, Dial M for Murdoch. You might be surprised about this. Tom Watson. I'm not often going to sing his praises. News Corruption and the Corruption of News Corporation, the Corruption of Britain. A brilliant, brilliant account of the hacking scandal. And this was published, I think, in 2011-12. So it doesn't go all the way through. It's before Rebecca Brooks was arrested and so on. But it talks about the endemic corruption and criminality in News International and the flagrancy in the spirit of which it happened, and the often just outright disregard for the rule of law and basic moral norms. Brilliant book. I think we can get that back up again. It was 50p. So you could get this. Was it 50p? Yeah, hardcover or paperback. You can get this and you can get Stick It Up Your Punter for £1. And knowledge isn't power, but it's the first step to it. If you want to know more about the British media, those are two good books to get you going. Next is Nick Davies, Flat Earth News. Wow. This is 10 years old, right? But it's a really punchy assessment of just how neck deep Britain's media is in what we would now call fake news. This is not a new phenomenon. How much is this? Oh, don't ever say I don't bring good value to people. Look at this. Hardcover, 50p. It's an amazing book. I mean, I know the cover looks crankish. That's the point. It talks about the increasingly prominent role of the public relations industry in media. It talks about the symbiosis between the political and media classes in this country. It talks about how journalists have actually given up on that one thing they're meant to care more deeply about than anything else, which is the truth. Brilliant book. Has accounts of the Observer, the Times. There's a bit towards the end, basically, where he just goes in on every single paper imaginable. The Mail, the Observer, Sunday Times under Andrew Neil. So it's pretty good to read it alongside Full Disclosure. The Dark Arts, how 10 Downing Street related a lot of facts, quote unquote, to the media, the private life of public relations, and the sort of rules of engagement in terms of PR and the media. An amazing assessment of basically the media landscape in the time of an Alastair Campbell. You know, this gentleman's trying to reinvent himself. Now he takes pictures of trees, I believe, on Twitter. And this isn't personal, by the way. Alastair Campbell, if he was born 30 years later, I'm sure he would have had very different political ideas, very different political values. But the media landscape of which he was a significant part and which he played better than anybody else is so aptly described here. And again, I think it's accurate to say that world was definitely marked by a deep antipathy to popular sovereignty, democracy, and often decency. Next book. I know I keep on saying this, but this is phenomenal. Aaron Kanani, The Muslims Are Coming. Aaron has done a podcast with us before. His name is spelled differently to mine. I know I've said that a lot of these books are breezy. Some are longer than others. This is 300 pages, but incredibly readable. And what's so valuable about it is that he gets just a case study after case study. Yeah, it's there. Look, it's reduced with Verso, £6. Important to say, actually, a lot of these books, the history of the world and 7 cheap things, Aaron Kanani, a few others, are out with Verso, and they're right now, I think, 40% sale. So, you know, in some cases, I think some of the ebooks they're doing right now are free. I don't think that covers any of these. I might be wrong. What Aaron Kanani does so phenomenally well is he gets case studies from London, Afghanistan, Minnesota, and he weaves these case studies, which are often quite remarkable. You think, wow, did this really happen? Within a broader intellectual history of the war on terror. And he just goes in on some people who are still very prominent in our media today. And quite frankly, they shouldn't be, because they've peddled outright racism for a very long time. You know, we've seen this so far in the debate around Islamophobia doesn't exist. If you want to be completely clued up as to what absolutely does exist and why the people that are saying that are racist, and actually we have, you know, multiple incidents of why that's a perfectly plausible thing to maintain that they're racist, read this book. Because a lot of the people who defended the war on terror to the hilt think the significant part of the domestic public in this country, or the US or France, people who are Muslims, deserve to be treated as second-class citizens. That's not acceptable. Never has been, never will be. Next book. Now, I'm going to be real with you. This is a thick read. Edward Said, Orientalism. If my fingers look messy, it's because I've been fixing stuff. And you can see from my knuckles, I came off a bit worse with rearranging some furniture a few days ago. Edward Said, Orientalism. Here's a tip. Don't read the introduction. Edward Said was in a battle, really, with a bunch of people after the publication of this book. He kind of took on a lot of Western scholars, people like Bernard Lewis. You know, maybe check out his Wikipedia or whatever. But the point is, the introduction does I think, Edward Said a disservice. He doesn't need to defend his ideas. Read the ideas. Show, don't tell. So skip that. A lot of people read the introduction. They say, wow, it's so boring. I can't finish this book. The actual book itself has superb prose, as is always the case with Edward Said, and this is intellectual history done at its best. It's phenomenal. You'll come out of it feeling just so liberated, just eyes wide open. Next, another Palestinian, Rashid Khalidi. This was out in January. 100 Years War on Palestine, a history of settler colonial conquest and resistance. We will get Rashid on hopefully this year. He was in Britain earlier this year. He'll be back in October. Well, we hope. But I think this is the best book I've read on the occupation of Palestine over the last 100 years. And that makes sense because Rashid Khalidi comes from a long line of Palestinian intellectuals in his family, but also it was written in January. So it's the most recent text. That's 50 Australian dollars. People shouldn't be too hurried, although it'll cost a bit more than the others because it's obviously newer. But the title says it all. The 100 Years War on Palestine. It starts really with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following Versailles. And you have to understand a lot of the problems in the Middle East today, whether it's Syria, Iraq, Palestine, a lot of it comes back to a political vacuum created by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Kurdistan, which we've still not come to terms with, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. He says 100 Years War. Why? Because you get the Balfour Declaration in the 1920s, you get the settlement of Palestine in the years before that, but primarily after it. This intensifies over the 1930s for obvious reasons. You then get an uprising in the 1930s against the occupation of Palestine, effectively by the British. A lot of Palestinians are killed in that uprising. And then, of course, you get the declaration of the State of Israel in the mid-1940s. You get the 7-day war, 6-day war, Yom Kippur War. You get the war in Lebanon in 1982. You get the first and second Intifada. It goes all the way through to the present day. And this 100-year war waged against the people. And it's important to say this isn't just a war waged by the State of Israel. It's also waged by imperial powers, first and foremost Britain. Often when people say, well, we have enough on our plate as the left in Britain, why should we care? Well, because Britain did more than anyone else to screw up vast swathes of the Middle East, and a long time before we invaded Iraq in 2003 as well. So there is a historical responsibility to at least know the facts about this stuff. Really, really, really brilliant book. Quite tough to read, I'll be honest, because it just is. But if you want a really strong history of understanding the hypocrisy at the heart of this debate, how the Palestinian people have been mistreated, not just by Israel, not just by Britain, not just by America, but also often actually by neighboring Arab states. If you want to know about the fraternal conflicts within the Palestinian people themselves, covers all of it. So very much recommended. Imagined Communities, this will be quick. Benedict Anderson, read it, brilliant book. The left will often say, no borders, nations don't exist. Nations don't exist, nationalisms do. And it matters, and the left has to have an account for that, as we saw with Brexit. I'm not going to go any further than that. And also, ultimately, nation states became the primary vehicle through which anti-colonial struggles were fought over the course of the 20th century. So it's certainly a problematic that the left has to deal with. Another great book, that'd probably be quite cheap as well. And that's with Verso, maybe it's reduced, I don't know. Going Dark, The Secret Lives of Extremists by Julia Ebner. This came out, I think, a month ago. We were meant to get Julia on the show. I think that couldn't happen for various reasons. So that's the next one, AI Superpowers. Julia Ebner basically went undercover with extremists. She went with trad wives. She went with, I don't like to use the word, Islamists, organizing through various groups like Telegram, WhatsApp. She goes to a neo-Nazi music festival. She meets up with some of the leading figures of Generation Identity. She is privy to some of the organizing behind the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. So if you want a snapshot of the far right, how it's organizing, how technologically literate it is, to the extent she's a great chapter on it about alt tech, about them creating their own technological platforms. Brilliant book. And perhaps the most concerning thing for me was the permeability between some of the extreme views she covers in the book and actually the extent to which they're often indulged by the quote unquote mainstream right. That's something I think we've got to watch out for over the next couple of years. Next book, a bit different. This is The New Economy. So we're kind of got 4 books left. AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. Outstanding. The hypothesis is essentially that AI, applications of AI, artificial intelligence, like machine learning, deep learning, doesn't need to look like Terminator 2, doesn't need to look like Skynet. These will add, I think one of the figures cited in the book is $13 trillion to the global economy by 2030. Ballpark figure. The concern is for many policymakers, about 80% of that accrues to the US and to China. So it's a bit like in the early 1800s when you get certain nation states all of a sudden upgrade their technological base to steam power. But imagine if only the US and China really applies AI properly. The rest of the world can't. Why? It's not just about access to technological development. It's also we don't have the data sets. China has 1.3 billion people. Data isn't the new oil. I don't really buy that line. But if you have let's be honest, an authoritarian state with 1.3 billion people it can constantly monitor, you're going to have a lot more data than what we have here in Europe, for instance. And so that's a big question for policymakers to ask. AI, as I talk about in my own book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, could play a huge role in a post-work, post-scarcity economy, but constrained by market relations, constrained by nation states. It won't do that. What it'll do is it'll further concentrate wealth, not just within countries, but within parts of countries. So, for instance, we see already with Silicon Valley, 50% of all the venture capital in the United States is in California. With the arrival of AI, that will get even worse. All the new jobs, the new wealth, the new big companies around AI will be created primarily in California and an analog to Silicon Valley, which exists in, I think it exists in Beijing. I could be wrong. Next book. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gary. Cory Doctorow, is that correct? Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom? Yeah. Wafi would be a terrible currency. Yeah, this is a brilliant book. It's the only novel I'm recommending. So I guess if you want 3 short books, Historical Capitalism, Capitalist Realism, and this. Really great book. A novel set in 22nd century Disneyland. There is a new currency. It's called Wafi. It's effectively a social currency. People live in conditions of post-scarcity. The only things that remain scarce are what we would call rivalrous positional goods. So what would remain scarce? The best seat in a restaurant, or the best view of the ocean from your flat, because you can't have multiple of these. But in terms of basic shelter, food, healthcare, education, we've moved to post-scarcity with all of these things. The problem is for the relatively few things that remain scarce, these rivalrous positional goods, there's a great deal of competition. And the currency which regulates it is Wafi. And Wafi is basically like a social credit score. There was an episode of Black Mirror, which I don't really watch, but this is the only one I saw, and I was like, oh, wow, this is like Wafi in Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. And what this talks about, really, what it hints towards, is the fact that you would still have domination, not necessarily exploitation, but for personal forms of domination, ostracism, loneliness, even in a post-scarcity society. That's an important thing for them to understand. You know, we could create a far better economy and society than we presently have, one where we completely abolish unnecessary suffering, one where everybody has access to all the things they need to live decent lives. I always talk about you can't have liberal ends. You can't have individuals determining their own lives, self-authoring their own lives without socialist means, access to housing, education, healthcare, transport, etc. But even if you have that, we'll still have nasty stuff happening. And I think it's important to remember that. Next, we're coming towards the end now. I think, am I right? I think this is the penultimate book. I might be wrong. Is that right? The People's Republic of Walmart. How the world's biggest corporations are laying the foundation for socialism by Lee Phillips and Michel Rozworski. We actually had them on a Tisky Sour not long ago. to talk about the book. It's a great book in so much as, well, what companies are enjoying the dividend of changed consumer habits as a result of COVID-19. Amazon, Tesco. One of the great lies of free market ideology is to say that these corporations aren't planned. One of the great lies of free market fundamentalism is to say that central planning is bad, leave it to the market solves everything. But what are firms if they aren't centrally planned? And this isn't a new thing, by the way. There's a neoliberal economist, a guy called Ronald Coase, talks about, if markets are so efficient at allocating resources, why do you need firms at all? And that goes back to the 1930s. And it's an interesting question. And the answer has always been, well, actually, if it's cost effective to internalize certain costs, you'll have a firm. If it's not cost effective, you won't have those things in the firm. They'll be outsourced. They'll go to the market. And the breakthrough of this book, People's Republic of Walmart, is to engage with an argument by Friedrich Hayek, fundamentally. Friedrich Hayek in 1944 wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom. And one of the primary points he made in that book was something which has since been called the socialist calculation debate. He doesn't start it. The idea of the socialist calculation debate starts with von Mises, 1930. But that's when it became a sort of populist idea. So what is the socialist calculation debate? Basically, it states that the market, through the price mechanism, internalizes far more and far better quality information than you can ever get in centrally planned economies. So no matter how well-intentioned you are, you're never going to get the same kinds of outcomes with central planning that you get through the market. Wow, that sounds really alluring, makes loads of sense. But then what these guys do is they say, well, with the development of big data, huge data sets, AI, machine learning, etc., perhaps that's no longer true. Perhaps actually, increasingly, the most profitable, most successful corporations will be increasingly centrally planned. And they look at Walmart as a sort of paradigmatic example of that. Another, of course, being Amazon in Britain. You could look at Tesco. But they look at the data, they look at the case studies, particularly of Walmart, and it's a really powerful hypothesis. And their conclusion is that even if Hayek and von Mises were once right about the socialist calculation debate, that's no longer true. It was a technologically, historically contingent point of view. And with the arrival of big data, with the move to greater informational abundance, the economics of information have significantly changed, which has all kinds of consequences in collective action, in media and politics and protest. One of them is they think the socialist calculation debate, and they think that even if Hayek was once right, he's no longer right. And I think that's a really interesting perspective for anyone who is committed to social justice. If we want to give housing to everyone, if we want to give, UBS to people, universal basic services of healthcare, transport, could central planning with these new technologies actually be more efficient than allocating resources through the market? I suspect they would be, actually, significantly so. But you'll have to make your own mind up. Republic of Walmart, excellent book. That'll be in the Verso sale, I guess. It'll have 40% off. Never a bad time to read it, but now it's particularly good. Then finally, I could not finish without saying, of course, Fully Automated Luxury Communism by me. I think it's good. And I'll tell you why I think I included it in this list of for you to read, is because it synthesizes a lot of the stuff that I've talked about so far, particularly the People's Republic of Walmart, particularly the stuff in the first 4 books, Historical Capitalism, Capitalist Realism, Marx, and A History of the World and 7 Cheap Things. Combining the framework you got in those earlier books, trying to understand the world as it is, trying to understand actually we live in a moment of profound economic and cultural and political crisis, if not collapse. COVID-19 is just one wave of that. And actually, at the same time, we're seeing the emergence of what Marx would call a new mode of production, premised upon a range of new technologies, renewable energy, AI, machine learning, but also things like cellular agriculture, synthetic biology. We could create very different kinds of societies than the ones we already have. People's Republic of Walmart is a brilliant intro into the central planning aspect of that. But in terms of trying to bring all those ideas together, I hope that's my contribution with Fully Automated Luxury Communism. So I'm going to quickly go to some questions, and then we'll see how quickly we wrap up. I'm kind of surprised actually how quickly that went. 46 minutes, hugely surprised. I thought it'd be much longer. Do you prefer Marx or Engels? That's really interesting. You know, there's an argument to be said that Engels was a better journalist than Marx. Engels would actually write a lot of the articles for Marx when he was writing for the New York Tribune. Engels often took a greater interest in sort of the current affairs of the day, and actually, on the condition of the working class in England, is excellent. On the working class in England, by the way, not on the English working class, because many of the labourers he's talking about in Manchester are Irish. It's a brilliant book, but as a theorist, I think Marx is clearly much better. But Engels, as a journalist, was a very, very talented writer. What's your favourite piece of fiction? Whew, that's a great question. Favourite piece of fiction? Oh, I'll come back to you. Probably something speculative or science fiction related. But then I also have a soft spot for Turgenev, Russian writer. Sons and Fathers is very good. We're going to political questions, are we? Do you ever write book notes? If so, would you be up for sharing them? Do I write? No. No, I don't. I write notes in the margins in pencil. Please do everyone a favor and never write notes with a pen. It's outrageous. I went through a period of writing them in post-it notes so that I had immaculate books, but I stopped doing that. Bungle. Marx and Engels were indirectly responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths during the 20th century. That's like saying the Bible is responsible for the Spanish Inquisition. It doesn't follow. Completely logical argument. Or Adam Smith is responsible for the Bengal famine. Dumb. Okay, boomer logic. Given that capitalism survived the 1890s, 1929, the 1970s, and 2008, why should we assume it won't survive the current crisis and climate change? That's a really great point, Greg. Really great point. And of course, it did survive, but it survived by changing. It survived by changing. The capitalism of post-1929 really is the Keynesian model you get after 45. It's very different to the classical liberalism you get before it. The crisis of the 1970s sees a return of that classical liberal model, neoliberalism, which was a very specific political project. So it adapts and it changes. The point is, the crisis we're living through today, can neoliberalism survive? No, it cannot. Levels of personal debt, sovereign debt are too high, working people are too far stretched, profitability in too many sectors is too low, there are no new markets. That's my personal view. It certainly can't continue with any measure of public consent. And that's before COVID-19. So can it survive? Of course it can survive. You know, I'm not a clairvoyant. Can neoliberalism survive what it's going through really since 2008? No more than it could after 1929, no. Any advice if you're writing your own book? Oof, Oliver, depends what you're writing. There's some funny. I'll answer some of the funny questions too. I wrote a blog on this in Medium after I wrote a PhD in like 6 months. I wrote 80% of a PhD in 6 months. What would I recommend? Quick coffee, drink tea, eat pasta, eat lots of carbs, drink lots of tea. Measure your concentration, not your time, is a big one, because we live in a very the attention economy with a world full of distractions. And measure your concentration, not your time, and write that down. So it's called the Pomodoro technique. I don't want to embarrass myself too much, but you should probably embrace that. And use Scrivener. If you're writing a book, use Scrivener. It's a great way of ordering a book rather than Pages or GDocs or whatever. Scrivener. I think there's a 30-day free trial. If you're ever writing even a master's dissertation, it's probably wise to invest in that. Next book. Question rather. Use Notion, Gary says. Any recommendations for Black history books in the UK? In the UK is a good question. I think my favorite history is, in terms of Black history, is Black Jacobins. There's actually a new book, I've not read it yet, I've got a review copy on the life of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. C.L.R. James wrote Black Jacobins about the Haitian Revolution. Obviously, Orientalism covers it to some extent. There are some books I want to read on Black history. They're quite radical ones. I don't want to necessarily talk about them here. Maybe it's another reading list. Frantz Fanon, obviously. But in terms of a UK perspective, Paul Gilroy, probably better to ask Ash, that one. Oliver Kant says he's writing a sci-fi book. Any recommendations on how to stop being a keyboard socialist and practice to get involved with? Very good question. Join a union. You have a job. Join a trade union. That's the first one. Second is talk to people. And there shouldn't really be, and this is one of the important parts of Marx, is that practice and theory aren't separate. You know, your engagement with the world in a concrete sense shouldn't be disaggregated from your intellectual engagement with it, right? You do something, you get results, you think about it. Can I improve it? Was this bad? Was this good? Feeds back into practice. You know, we can talk about Marx and political economy. A bodybuilder will do that. I did concentration curls one day. They didn't work. I'm going to do Scott curls the next. I did close grip on the barbell, wide grip on the barbell. Theory and practice. I'm taking the mickey, but ultimately you need both. And the idea that a keyboard socialist isn't a real socialist and needs to get on the real world, not necessarily true. You should be organizing in your workplace. You should be arguing for ideas at the ballot box and also in everyday life. But at the same time, they need to be refined, engagement. More. Is UBI a likely response to COVID-19 relief efforts? Will UBI move beyond the coronavirus crisis into normal time? It's a really good question. What we have to remember is the council tax in this country, which is crazy. It's the most dysfunctional policy in Britain, was introduced as an emergency measure to the failed poll tax 28 years ago. James Butler talked about this on The Burner the other day, our fantastic daily podcast, which you all should go subscribe to now on iTunes. I think it's one of the top performing new podcasts on iTunes under the news category. And he made this point. It's a really good point. Council tax was an emergency measure. It's still there 28 years later. It's very possible that some, off the hoof kind of ad hoc responses to this crisis become permanent features of British politics. We might have to, for instance, nationalise the aviation sector. And there'd be an argument actually to keep it in public ownership because we want to ration it, and we want to tax the hell out of people who take frequent flights, which is going to raise a lot of revenues. So, I mean, that might be one thing, that if we nationalise the aviation industry, which I think we probably should, that it may stay in public ownership. So many of these responses may become permanent. Would UBI be one of them? I'm not so sure. UBI the whole point of UBI is that it's universal. That's not even being sort of argued for in the US. Mitt Romney, when he made his famous intervention not long ago, talking for basically helicopter money of $1,000 per person, that was for every adult and it was time limited. You know, for the homeless, parachute payments to every homeless person, if you get £1,000 every month for 6 months, I mean, that might be a really effective intervention. It's had some testing. There's a book I've not included here, Rutger Bregman, Utopia for Realists. He talks about some of these interventions. A UBI for rough sleepers or for women escaping violent households, really effective. But again, that's not really a UBI because it's not universal. It's a very tailored intervention. Aaron, do you like Gramsci? I do. I think it's a bit overrated, personally. I think there's often a quest to look for ideas, be a bit trendy. I love Gramsci, by the way, but sort of be a bit trendy. Marx covers a lot. Marx covers a lot already that sort of Gramsci goes over again. The stuff that Gramsci does very well is, of course, the conversation around hegemony and the revision of the inability of the left, of the radical left, to transform society. The more developed capitalism became. Of course, that was one of Marx's conclusions. He had many on this, actually. One of his conclusions was the more advanced capitalism became, the more powerful and potent contradictions became, therefore the more powerful revolutionary forces became to create a different kind of society. That doesn't happen. Gramsci says, why not? And he talks about the idea that power is reproduced in the interests of the ruling class, not just through coercion, through the police, the army, but also through consent, the manufacture of consent. And so the ideology that is necessary to maintain the status quo is propagated through civil society organizations, schools, churches, etc. So that's Gramsci's kind of original thing, hegemony and the historic block of interest and how you have to push back against that. I don't see it as that different to certain readings of Marx. My personal reading of Marx, which I talk about in Fully Automated Luxury Communism, actually, I don't think Gramsci's that big a development on what Marx said elsewhere. What do you think of Adorno and his ideas of aesthetics? I don't read Adorno. I read Minima Moralia. Okay. Not for me. We're all different. Any more rocket emojis? I'll take 2 more questions. Should we have a general strike after this crisis is over? I mean, there is a general strike. There's been a very deep involuntary withdrawal of labour. That's the problem. You know, there's been much talk of a war economy, but with a war economy, you actually get the full mobilisation of resources, land, labour, capital, to achieve a certain end, right? It's kind of like capitalism in overdrive. This isn't a war economy. This is the complete opposite of the mobilisation of the factors of production. This is a pandemic economy. So, I mean, a strike. I mean, I'm all for strikes if workers have concrete aims to win at the end of them. But hey, this is a good question. Do you sleep in quietude? Do you walk in peace? I sleep beautifully well. You know why? I use white noise machine. Very good. Much recommended. Changed my life. I'll take the last. I'll take the last question. Do you read 2 books at once? Do you read fun, easy reads, and do you also read tough, thick texts? I do read 2 books at once. Yeah, I try not to make a massive habit of it though, but it does happen. You shouldn't be too worried about it. Oliver Kant, hot take. Derrida is the most dull academic ever. I kind of agree about that. Look, it's perfectly plausible. I got this with Paolo Virilio. It's perfectly possible. Paolo Virilio is actually probably the worst time it happened. I was reading Virilio and I thought, you know what? This guy is a complete phony. I could be wrong. You know, maybe you get something out of him. Deleuze and Guattari, there's a lot of stuff that I enjoy that they write. A lot of it's kind of ropey. But then people say the same about Foucault, and I say, well, no, he's fantastic. He's a hugely important writer in the Western canon, or indeed the human canon, the global canon. I'll take 1 more. I'll take 1 more, and then we'll call it quits. Thoughts on academia by 123 Duck. What a great question. Complex. It's an important site of conflict. Shouldn't be given up, obviously. And if you look at the trajectory of the neoliberal movement from the 1950s, 60s, they viewed the academy as an important site of contestation. If you look at the history of James Buchanan at Virginia Tech, at George Mason University, if you look at Hayek and the kind of patronage he enjoys at the London School of Economics, and later, more importantly, Chicago University, these ideas don't get wider salience without the prestige and the privilege enjoyed by academics in university institutions, research institutions. So universities matter, academics and intellectuals matter. At the same time, universities clearly transformed over the last particularly 10 years, but it goes back before then, of course, the neoliberal university. And it's why I think we really need to fight very hard for something different. At the same time, and it's part of the project with Novara Media, is that intellectual discovery should obviously transcend the walls of a research institution or a university. It's one of the few good things about the internet. Isn't that you just read something online, but you can have conversations with people you otherwise wouldn't have met. You can engage with ideas you otherwise never would have heard of. I've recommended 20 books today. You can go and buy them or loan them from the library. So it's not a binary of the offline, the online world. But I do think that the digital media environment, the hybrid media environment, is a better way of understanding it. Book by Andrew Chadwick, looking at that. I think it does ask questions about actually what is intellectualism, what is intellectuality, who is the intellectual? And there's some ideas that cover this in the 60s, the 70s, in Italian sort of autonomous thinking about the mass intellectual. And I think that's certainly, in my view, that's something that Novara has always aimed at, is we're trying to engage with an audience that is feeding back to us ideas, which is part of a broader movement. Okay, this is the last one I'll take. Favorite utopian fiction. Oh, favorite utopian fiction. Red Mars. Red Mars is very good. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. We're going to have Tysky Sour live tonight at 8 p.m. That's going to be with Michael Walker, myself. I don't know who else. But we're back at 8. 400 watching, only 256 thumbs. Smash the like button and subscribe so you can watch us later on this evening on Tysky Sour. We're back on Friday as well with Michael Brooks to discuss all things relating to the US presidential race, Democrat nomination, what a clusterfuck it is in the US right now. So I'll see you later at 8 p.m. right here on the Navarro Media YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe.